I did. And so basically, my wife confronted me about it, and we were driving from St. George, Utah to Las Vegas as part of this hiking trip, like through the desert, basically. And I had this vision come up that was sort of like the three of us sort of coexisting peacefully, getting along, everyone knowing about each other, and maybe even the two of them being friends. And it just seemed like heaven and the best possible world that could possibly exist. And I told my wife about this, and she was not particularly interested, to say the least, and almost broke up that night. But basically, I spent the next month doing some research on polyamory and reading about it. And the more I learned, the more I said, this is me. And so about a month later, we ended up seeing a couples counselor, and the third time we saw her, which is when I basically admitted, no, like, I do want to see other people, not just like flirt, I actually want to date other people. And my wife said, I don't want to do that. And the counselor said, well, there's nothing I can do for you. You want to see me separately, okay, but that's it. And the next day, I packed up a bag and left Staten Island, and it was pretty abrupt. So that A Bit Too Much About Me show was about, it was about the mental health with bipolar. It was about the journey with the relationships and polyamory, and it was about becoming more of a writer. And the big difference here was that I was actually on stage at the piano playing the show and singing and saying to the audience, this is my life. It was the first time I publicly said, I am bipolar. And the quote at the very end of the show is, the doctors say I'm bipolar, and I don't disagree, but I just call myself me.
Mm-hmm. Which you should.
So, yeah.
I mean, we all have something. It doesn't define who we are. It's more like what we just live with.
Absolutely, yeah. It's owning my story, owning our stories. And as you said, everyone has something, even if it's not diagnosable as a medical or a mental condition. There's something going on. For
sure. Did you ever end up with your crush?
No, but I actually did run into her about a year later, and like in public, and I told her at that point that I'd had this big crush on her, and just telling her that was such a relief, and I was like, okay, I guess it's full circle now, and I can let it go.
What'd she say? Thanks.
I don't think she said like, oh, like, that's sweet or something. You know, like, she didn't say anything back about it.
Well, that's too bad.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I definitely wanted to also talk about this most recent episode. So I went 4 years without another episode, and I was on antipsychotics for some of that time, and then it was determined, or I guess I decided that I didn't need them. And the plan was that I would just be on lithium and Lamictal, and if I started to feel hypomanic, which means a milder, more in-control version of mania, that I would take risperidone, which is an antipsychotic. And this actually happened a number of times, maybe 3 or 4 or more times in those 4 years, and it worked, and it stopped the mania from getting out of control. And I was very confident. In fact, I went up to the NAMI New York State Conference last year and presented my show and basically said, I'm in control of my bipolar, my mania, and it's not going to happen again. So then we got to basically this June and July when you mentioned life stress, and it was a huge amount of change in my life. In a period of 2 months, I decided to move home from New York to D.C., and I had lived in New York for 10 years at that point. So I decided to move. I had a girlfriend in New York, and I was starting a new relationship in D.C. at the same time. And then I went to the beach with her, like my current girlfriend, Lena. Went to the beach with her, and then the next week I went sailing with my family for July 4th. And then the next week I moved back. I went back to New York to pack up my apartment, open a storage unit, and then came back home. All that was happening. And within about a week or two of moving back, I started to become very manic. And I tried the risperidone, and it sort of helped for a few days. I think the first day, it really, I mean, to be honest, I was probably hypomanic for at least a month or two before this point. I'd been getting slightly less sleep than typical for me. I'd spend maybe 6 to 7 hours instead of 7 to 8 hours a night. But it was the long stretch of that happening.
And sleep is very important for our mental health.
Oh, yeah,
and you know you're in trouble if you're getting less sleep and not really feeling like you miss it the next day.
Yeah, totally. And my dad says that sleep is the bedrock of health, and I definitely agree with that. So I was over at Lena's one night, and I was looking at this glass thing she has on her table. It's a pyramid with a pyramid inside of it, and there's this idea I've had about the insight pyramid, which means that sort of what's the maximum amount of insight that one can have about themselves. And I felt like I reached that point that night, but then I realized that I was totally alone at the top of this pyramid or this mountain, and I got terrified. And I also then had this idea that this universe is actually one-dimensional, even though it appears to be 3 or 4-dimensional if you count time, but that's an illusion. And then I got terrified that I was trapped in one dimension and had to reason myself into how actually I'm not trapped. So it was this pretty scary night. And then I was actually okay for a few days, but there were these little blips of things. I woke up my parents at 1 in the morning to do this meditation ritual that I just made up that night. And then another night I woke up at 4 in the morning, and I was convinced that Lena had been kidnapped by 3 people I knew, including one of my best friends. And the reason I was convinced is because I had texted her back 1 minute after she had texted me, and then she didn't respond. And she had read receipts on, and she didn't even read it. So I said, oh, well, obviously the kidnappers got her before she could look at her phone again, and they turned off her phone, and they used the gloves and put it in the bag, and they're waiting outside our door with guns and trying to get ransom for her.
Wow.
The whole thing. And it took my parents 2 hours to convince me that maybe she wasn't kidnapped, and maybe we didn't have to call the cops or the apartment door person. So that was a scary thing. And then I was okay again for a day or two. And then I remember it was July 25th. I was going on errands with my mom. We had to go to the bank and the post office or the UPS store to basically mail this cashier's check with a security deposit from my old apartment. Doesn't matter, but I had this idea, before I leave, I have to build this altar to my creativity and to money, and so I put these books and these symbols down in the corner of their room. And I was like, I have to only wear the bare minimum of what's necessary and the lightest outfit. So I wore all white, and I didn't wear socks, and I didn't wear underwear. And I went to the bank like that, and I went to the UPS store. And at that point, I had this strong sense that, so I used to work as basically a personal assistant for a billionaire. And I had this sense that he had set up this game with my dad, and that if I solved all the clues of the game, which had math problems and sort of logic things, if I solved it, that he would appear with a check for $1 million. And he didn't appear, so we went home, and my mom and I started cooking chili, and then I guess I had this sense again, oh, wait, there's more to the game. So I ended up going into the hallway, and it got out of control very quickly. I started looking up at the lights in the hallway and screaming. I screamed the word whiteout at one of the lights really loud for a really long time, and apparently sort of said inappropriate things to neighbors. And there were 5 people who reported this to the front desk. And basically what happened was the front desk person, who wasn't really sure how to handle it or even what was going on, called the police, the cops. And so I found myself being surrounded by, must have been 5 officers in the hallway and being handcuffed. And I thought this was a part of the game. I was like, wow, this is a really impressive game they've set up for me.
Wow, yeah.
So joking around with the cops, whatever. We went downstairs. I saw that there was an ambulance outside. I was like, oh, my God, this is an amazing game. They did a great job. So they told me.
They had all the pieces in place for you, huh?
Yeah, I was like, wow, I felt really special.
All this just for you. But it was all for you, though, but it wasn't a game.
It was, yeah, and I got in the ambulance and, in the stretcher and lay down, and my parents were sitting in the back with me, still handcuffed, and, the handcuffs start really hurting me, and I'm, hearing what's going on, and I had this, it was like my reality, the universe that I was in shifted immediately. And I was like, oh, my God, this isn't a game. This is real life. I'm in an ambulance going to the hospital, and I'm going to be in the hospital. And I was, so angry about it. And I remember getting to the emergency room, waiting area on the stretcher, still handcuffed, and just, screaming, what the F kind of game is this? So loud. And it was basically a rough night. We were there for 21 hours while the doctors tried to give me the option of voluntarily admitting myself to Georgetown, where I was, or if they were going to have to involuntarily commit me, which is generally a pretty bad outcome because, I ended up not having a whole lot of rights once I was involuntarily. So I ended up getting sent to the Psychiatric Institute of Washington, and for some reason, I guess they didn't have many beds, so I was put in the drug and alcohol rehab unit, and I think I was the only person with sort of a, I guess they call a psychotic type thing, and it was honestly probably the worst 5 days of my life in there.
Mm-hmm. It sounds really scary.
Yeah, it was.
Especially when you don't know what your reality versus imagination and all that is going on, and not knowing what's real, what's true.
Yeah, at that point, I was quite aware that it was all real, but in a way, it seemed not real because it was so absurd what was happening. It was there were these incredibly strict and arbitrary rules. For example, at 8 p.m., there was a window for people to get their medicine. People wait in line, and then once you get your medicine, you get a snack. And there was this one woman in there who was pregnant, or kept saying she was pregnant, and she was like, I'm hungry, can I get my snack? And they're like, nope, not till you take your medicine. I'm like, why does this matter? There's all these things, and the TV staying on till 10, and me having to stay in my room, even though my roommate was screaming his head off in the middle of the night, and all this stuff. And, even this thing where I told my parents, look, I'm ready to get out of here. I'm terrified. I'm feeling much better. Again, the third day, I basically woke up feeling totally grounded and not in this other world anymore. And I guess they were a little bit concerned, so they said maybe you should stay another night. And what happened was the doctor there set up a meeting with them for the next day, and then a meeting with all of us for the following day. And that night, there was actually a street fight, basically, in the unit. Where two guys, one of them, picked up a chair, I think, and another one picked up this, rolly thing that has a trash can on it and, threatened each other with it. And I told my parents, I got to get out of here. And they're like, okay, you're right. We'll get you out of there tomorrow. We'll try to. And then it turned out that the doctor and my parents were there at the same time, but they hadn't set up, it wasn't the right meeting. So they wouldn't let me even think about leaving till the next day. It was totally agonizing. But thankfully, I did get out the next day, and since then, I felt much more grounded. But I have to say that I went back to Albany this year, just about a month ago, to do another presentation for the NAMI New York State Conference. And, so at the end of the show, I basically added this whole thing about the third episode and basically saying that I stood here last year winning the Young Leader Award and telling you that I got this, And now I'm standing here telling you that I don't know